Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here. I was last in Salt Lake City 4 years ago and did grand rounds then. Hopefully, either you have forgotten that or have actively pushed it out of your memory. But it's, the world of early brain and child development is one that really changes so much, not because of the root ideas, but because we're learning new ways to really work on these concepts over time. So it's a delight to be able to speak about it again and to really kind of think about the larger context and picture of what we have. So the standard disclosure slide, I have no relevant financial relationships to disclose, not for liable investigational use in my presentation, et cetera, et cetera. Although the one disclosure I always have is that if you hang around me, weird things might happen to you. These are my kids, some actually now a few years ago, and I warned them that their faces would freeze like this if they did that too long. They claim it was from having to listen to me talk, So we'll talk about a few things on our short journey today. We'll talk about the science of early brain and child development. We'll talk about the result of what happens when we don't get things right for children and families early on. We'll talk about principles of solutions, because there's no one magic bullet to all this, and then kind of wrap it up with some big picture kind of concepts that I think will help us in terms of messaging this to others and getting this concept across. However, one of my 8 zillion degrees, yes, I have a lot of student loan debt, is actually in library science. I do hold a degree in children's librarianship, so I always like to start off with story time because I think even adults deserve a story. So I'm going to read to you from a book by Peter H. Reynolds called The Dot. Okay. Art class was over, but Vashti sat glued to her chair. Her paper was empty. Vashti's teacher leaned over the blank paper. "Ah, a polar bear in a snowstorm," she said. "Very funny," said Vashti. "I just can't draw." Her teacher smiled. "Just make a mark and see where it takes you." Vashti grabbed a marker and gave the paper a good, strong jab. "There!" Her teacher picked up the paper and studied it carefully. She pushed the paper toward Vashti and quietly said, "Now sign it." Vashti thought for a moment. "Well, maybe I can't draw, but I can sign my name." The next week, when Vashti walked into art class, she was surprised to see what was hanging above her teacher's desk. It was the little dot she had drawn, her dot, all framed in swirly gold. I can make a better dot than that." She opened her never-before-used set of watercolors and set to work. Vashti painted and painted, a red dot, a purple dot, a yellow dot, a blue dot. The blue mixed with the yellow. She discovered she could make a green dot. Vashti kept experimenting, lots of little dots in many colors. "If I can make little dots, I can make big dots too." Vashti splashed her colors with a bigger brush on bigger paper to make bigger dots. Vashti even made a dot by not painting a dot. At the school art show a few weeks later, Vashti's many dots made quite a splash. Vashti noticed a little boy gazing up at her. "You're a really great artist. I wish I could draw," he said. "I bet you can," said Vashti. "Me? No, not me. I can't draw a straight line with a ruler." Vashti smiled. She handed the boy a blank sheet of paper. "Show me." The boy's pencil shook as he drew his line. Vashti stared at the boy's squiggle, and then she said, "Please, sign it." I'll come back to that story because there's a reason I chose it, but let's now go on and talk about the science. The American Academy of Pediatrics has this agenda for children that they lay out every year. Most of it remains the same, but in the center are the current strategic priorities for the Academy. This one's from a few years ago, but still in the center there is this idea of early brain and child development. We set up a leadership group at the National AAP, and I'm proud to have served on that when we were in our active formation stage. This is our motto: building brains, forging futures. You need something you can put on a coffee cup or something. But actually, it's the subhead that I think is more important, this idea that it's all about nurturing relationships. Now, to a certain extent, it's like, oh, yes, nurturing relationships, isn't that special? Yes, it is, but there's a deep science behind this, and that's really what I'm trying to go through here, is that the relationships matter, and it's not just because it's a nice thing or a cute thing, but that there's actually a depth to this. There's an urgency. Too many kids are being failed by our society. We are failing kids long before they have the opportunity to fail us, right? That comes later on. Really, we're not doing so well for them. And this is the essential role of us. And by us, I mean any of us who touch the lives of children. And I'm not talking about just healthcare. I'm also talking about education and social services and community and so on, that we see what happens. A lot of the work I do is in advocacy. And people ask, gee, why do you do advocacy work? That's not doctory stuff, right? You don't learn that in medical school and residency and all that business. Well, one, that's changing. But number two, I would also say that what happens is when we don't get things right for children and families, those issues, those problems end up in our waiting rooms. And then we're banging our heads against the wall trying to figure out how to fix these things, and we don't have fantastic solutions for later on. We don't have magic medicines to get this all, make this all go away and so on. So it is our problem, and that's why I get involved, and hopefully you do as well. Now, the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child came out with a report some years ago where they said, let's take the science of what we've learned about the early brain and try to put this together into big points that we can use to drive not just programs and how we work with people, but also policy. And I want to walk us through those things. The first thing they did was they said, child development is a foundation for community and economic development. Now, I think most of us aren't used to thinking about kids in that way, right? We think that helping kids is inherently a good thing because they're kids and we should help them. However, we also need to recognize that investing in the infrastructure of the early brain is as much a part of infrastructure development in our society as highways and bridges and airports and tunnels. Okay, in my state, in Wisconsin, we are currently wringing our hands about the transportation budget and highways and whatever. And what I want to know is, fine, but where is the money and the discussion and the hand-wringing over the early brain infrastructure? You need to have people in a society to help to have a society. You need to have productive workers. You need to have inventors. You need to have creators. You need to have consumers. So the early brain, investing in the early brain is investing in the future of our society and our economy the same way that we think about these physical items like bridges and tunnels and so on. Number two, brains are built over time. We have a chance to get it right if we didn't get it right early. But that also means that you can't just put all your money in the first year or so of life and then say, great, we're done, yay, we did it, nothing else to do now, right? You need to make gains, but then you need to support those gains over time and do so with substantial programs, good school investment, and even in adult learning and so on. So it's sort of a three-legged stool you can think of for how kids' development and health is going to go over time. One is the biological factors that we look at all the time in healthcare. Okay, that's important. We know that. But number two is the socioeconomic environment. And we have known for a very long time that the zip code a child is born and brought up in matters more than their genetic code in terms of their outcomes. And a few blocks can make a big difference. There's a fantastic article out there showing subway maps of different major cities and showing you the life expectancies of the neighborhoods around particular stops. Three stops on a subway line can suddenly add or take away 10, 20 years of life expectancy because of the influence of the socioeconomic environment. But then we realized it's not just that broad socioeconomic environment. It also has to do with the microenvironment. Who's around? Who's at home? Who's in the neighborhood? Who's in the child care center? And how are they interacting? These attachment and relationship patterns matter just as much as these other factors. And that brings me to the next point, that there's two things that influence the architecture of the developing brain. It's your genes and it's your experiences. And I like to think of it as being like a campfire. You need to have wood and you need that spark to get that fire going. You can't have one without the other. So yes, the genes are important, and through the science of epigenetics we know that we can make some modifications to how genes are expressed. Won't spend time on that this morning. But we can modify experiences very easily, and we do that through policies and programs and coaching and advice and all the sorts of things that we do. So we can mold experiences relatively easily. And if you had to pick out what's the active ingredient, what is it that makes the difference? It's the serve and return nature of a child's interaction with caring, loving adults. Serve and return, like in tennis, that back and forth. When a child looks at an adult and an adult looks at them and they're doing that back and forth, it's like a duet. That back and forth is what drives development. There is no DVD, TV program, app, etc. that does a darn thing to drive development in children under age 2, period. No evidence for that. I don't care what it says on the App Store or the back of the box or whatever. And parents need to hear that from us really clearly. because they're not getting it. They're saying, but it says on the back here, it's like, yeah, I'm sorry, that's actually deceptive marketing. So they need to realize that it's that back and forth interaction. So to highlight this, I'm going to play a video for you. I used to work for Ed Tronick. He's head of the Child Development Unit at Children's Hospital in Boston. He developed this face-to-face paradigm that he'll explain, and you'll see what happens when interactions go well. I should add that all the videos I show today are freely available on YouTube. So if you want to watch them again, or if folks that are watching from remote sites aren't getting a good quality video, they can watch it later on YouTube just by typing in face-to-face paradigm, Tronick, things like that.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In this still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm like a girl. Oh,
and she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
yes.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this, and then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, come on, why aren't we doing this? Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it, they actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
So I used to code these videotapes as an undergrad, and this was not a disturbing interaction, right? The baby did not get what they expected. They started crying. When mom came back, a couple of seconds, big smiles, everyone's fine. No children were harmed in the making of this video. So the hard part was when the mom would go into the still face and the baby wouldn't do anything. Why? Because they weren't used to seeing this. They weren't used to this face-to-face interaction, so they didn't feel the loss of it. Now, I want to be really clear. I don't believe for a moment that any of the parents we studied, or any parents anywhere really, don't want the best for their children. I think they all do. I think they care about their kids. They want to see them do well, and so on. The thing is, we think of this back and forth interaction as being natural and instinctual. It's actually not. It's learned behavior. We do it because others model it for us. And then we get reinforcement, right? If you do peekaboo with a baby, right, what do? They smile at you, right? So then you say, hey, this is great, and you keep doing it. Right? So there's this feedback loop. But if you're living in a community or an environment where this back and forth interaction doesn't happen, you don't think to do it. Now here's the thing. We do a lot of work in messaging to parents around things like talk to your child, sing to your child, read to your child, all that. We put billboards up, we put ads on the bus, TV ads, whatever. Most parents have seen these. I have virtually never run into a parent who, when I say that, looks at me in surprise, okay? So we have done a good job of fulfilling the information gap for the most part. They get it. The problem is the skills gap. Because you go home with your 6-month-old and you sit them down and you think, okay, they told me to talk to my child, I'll talk to them. And they start talking and they start feeling kind of foolish, right? Because the 6-month-old, they're not going to talk back. So then they wonder, am I doing this right? Maybe I'm not the right person to be doing this because I'm not smart and educated. Maybe I'm not, the person who my kid needs because I didn't do well in school. So maybe they need this DVD that says it's made by educators or whatever, right? You get this self-talk, that a lot of parents, particularly in low socioeconomic circumstances, struggle with, that they think they're not going to teach their child something useful. So all these things really play into it. So what we need is not to fulfill an information gap so much, we should still do that, but a skills gap. And we can do that through advice and coaching and helping parents see, oh yeah, you see when you did that, your baby did that. Oh, okay, and learn how to read their child's behavior. This does not take a 20-week training course, okay? This is something that can actually be done in small ways in many different settings, whether it's healthcare or education or anywhere else. The next point is pretty simple. You need simple circuits and skills to do more complicated things. So when people ask sometimes, why are we putting all this money into children just playing, right? Early childhood education, my goodness, they're just sitting there and playing all day. How much can that possibly cost? Well, play is the work of infancy. Okay, this is that child's job. They need to develop these skills in order to be able to do more things and learn effectively and so on later on. So if you want to think of early childhood education as early workforce development, be my guest. That works, But really, this is that child's job. It's not merely play. It's not entertainment. It is actually their job in a sense. We're going to spend some time talking about toxic stress, which I'll define more carefully in a moment. But it's associated with persistent effects on the neuroendocrine system and causes lifelong issues in not just mental and behavioral health, but also in measures of physical health. So you don't need to be a radiologist to say that, gee, there's a big difference between these two head CT scans. These are both 3-year-old kids. The one on the left is a typically developing child. The one on the right underwent extreme emotional neglect. This is a child from a large Eastern European orphanage where they had too many kids and not enough staff. And they were getting all their physical needs met. Okay, they were fed and bathed and clothed and all that stuff, but they were having to move so quickly from person to person that there was minimal interaction. Okay, that head is much smaller on the right. That brain looks shrunk, so you can tell that, without knowing a whole lot about how to read the finer points here. Now let's talk very briefly about the stress response. So in our society, when we talk colloquially about stress, we think of stress as being a negative thing. The thing is, we need a stress response system to be able to not only react and respond to changes in our environment, but also to learn new skills. Okay, if things don't happen the way you expect. Think about a newborn on the first day of life, right? They're coming out and, oh my goodness, they have to deal with temperature changes and lights and noise and, oh my goodness, this weird sensation called hunger, right? That sets in for the first time. I mean, all of these are significant stressors, and I'm always amazed that newborns just don't go completely to bits, on the first day. They're dealing with a lot, and they do it fine. They somehow manage. So we use stress response systems to be able to adapt and learn all these sorts of things over time. And this becomes critical. Now we do things, our stress response system in its classic way where we release epinephrine and cortisol and all that is designed for the issue where you're in mortal danger. You're walking along and you see a bear. Okay, oh my God, I'm going to die, right? And you start releasing these hormones, etc., because it helps your body adapt for that short-term danger. It's a fantastic system for getting you out of those dangerous situations. It is absolutely terrible when it's firing all the time, and you'll see what I mean by that. So conceptually, you can think of 3 levels of stress response. You have positive stress. This is actually a good thing. It's positive, right? This is how we adapt. This is why we give people exams, right? A little bit of stress is a significant motivator. I like to joke that this happens every time I give a talk. And that's a great thing. You don't want me falling asleep up here. You don't want me forgetting what to say. You want, if something doesn't work, the slides, the sound, whatever, you want me to be able to react and respond to that. So positive stress, good thing. Then you have tolerable stress. These are more significant stressors, but they're temporary. The stress level goes up, but then it comes down eventually, and there's a buffering effect from supportive relationships. Whether that's emotionally supportive, hey, I heard you had a rough day, do you want to talk about it? or whether it's practically supportive, like, hey, I heard you had a fire in your apartment, do you need a place to stay? Or both together. Those things buffer the effects of stressful circumstances and make it tolerable. But then we have the third category, toxic stress. This is not necessarily a single bad stressor. This could be the same as tolerable stress, except it's not as temporary. The stress levels go up and stay up for longer periods of time, and there's few or no protective relationships. When people don't have the social capital, when they don't have the connections, when they don't have resources to fall back onto, something that was tolerable becomes toxic. And something that could be toxic may become tolerable if those resources are there. So in a child's life, when you have these really long-term bad situations, so no supportive relationships, think about things like child abuse, parental substance abuse, homelessness, right? These sadly are not usually one short discrete event. These are usually long-term sorts of issues. These sorts of things affect the very biology of the child and their brain development in such a way that it has been called toxic stress. And I want to be very clear, this happens to young children. If you're talking about a child who's had a reasonably good upbringing and then like at 12 they start experiencing all these things, they already have a fair number of the resources. I'm not saying it's all okay and that it's going to be just fine, but what I'm saying is that they have many of the mental resources, the brain structures, etc., to be able to cope. That doesn't happen if you're always getting these scary things happening early. Your brain wires for short-term danger over and over. So what happens is you have these childhood stressors. This fight or flight response that's meant to be looking for bear, it becomes chronic. You're pushing out these hormones. It changes the brain in a few ways we'll talk about in just a second, but you get this hyper-responsive stress response. You're not as calm, you can't cope as well, and that feeds into more stress and over and over and over. So it's really this, the issue becomes the short-term response system is being used over and over and over for long-term coping, which it was never designed to do. And if you never have the opportunity to develop the long-term coping, it's just not going to happen. And then you see things happen. So what happens in the brain? One slide where we look at three brain structures. One is the amygdala. So the amygdala is our fear center, right? The worry ward of the brain. This is what lights up when that bear shows up, right? This is about self-preservation. This is about running for it. In children who've had early adversity, we actually see that their amygdala actually are somewhat larger. This is work that's been done right at UW-Madison by Seth Pollack. He does MRI scans on kids and compares it to their experiences to date. And it's probably from a stimulation of the amygdala over and over early on in life. Countering the amygdala are two areas. One is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is your executive functioning, your planning, your delayed gratification, and all those sorts of things. On functional MRI, we see less activity there and less neuronal density in those kids. And then the hippocampus, which plays a big role in memory and mood, the hippocampal volumes are actually smaller in these kids as well. And again, he's shown all this through multiple scans over larger populations and says that, yeah, there's a statistically significant difference there. Now, here's the issue. I work in primary care pediatrics. I work in a community health center. I do not go loading kids into scanners left and right. In fact, I cannot remember the last time I personally ordered a head MRI. So it's expensive, and it's actually not going to give me a whole lot of information that'll change what I do when a kid is coming in for school or behavioral evaluations, at least in primary care. And no parent has ever come in to me and say, "Doctor, we're here today because I think my child's hippocampal volumes are too small." That hasn't happened yet. So what do I hear? The school's concerned. The parents are concerned, et cetera, because the kid is impulsive. They can't plan ahead. They're anxious. They can't seem to delay gratification. They got to have it right now. Their mood's all over the place. Their memory's terrible. This sounds a lot like what we often call ADHD, right? Sounds really familiar. Here's the thing, though. I think for many of us, right, we see kids with classic ADHD. The kid's trying, the school's trying, the parents trying, everyone's trying, and the kid just cannot pay attention. And you know what? Many of them do pretty good with often a relatively small dose of stimulant medication. They actually do pretty well, and their grades come up, their self-esteem comes up, everyone's happy, yay, great, wonderful. So that's probably about 5 of my patients. Not 5%, 5, okay? So what about all these other kids I have in my practice with the ADHD label? They have attentional issues. They have trouble staying on task. They are fidgety and squirmy and getting up and acting without thinking. And medication only kind of helps, right? And you're sitting there going, but why? Why is their response to this so poor? So when I do my evaluations, I say start from the beginning, start from pregnancy, tell me everything that happened. And not just, the APGAR scores and the birth weight and all this, that's important. Were you ever homeless? Have you always had enough food in the house? Did your child ever witness domestic violence? Et cetera, et cetera. And what do I hear? Yes, yes, yes. And you start to realize by the time I'm seeing them at 5, 6, 8, 12, whatever age it is, the pileup of stressors that this child has had to deal with from a really young age is really having its toll. And what I start to ask myself is this really ADHD? Or is this the brain effects of adversity that we just talked about? The thing being that there's no magic medication that's going to make that go away. So we do the best we can, and we do the best we can with therapy and all, which does work, but is hard to find and expensive, and it requires a commitment on the family that is usually still stressed, right? Oh, I found this therapist for you, and if you see them twice a week for this many weeks, we'll see what happens. And the parents looking at me like, I nearly got fired from my job to come here just today. I can't commit to that. And they need their job, right? They need their home. They need all those sorts of things. So this becomes a very challenging cycle if we don't prevent it early on. So when kids have these experiences, we hope they're good experiences. It leads to good, quote-unquote, brain development and epigenetic changes that also influence brain development. And that comes out in what we call, quote-unquote, good behavior, adaptive or healthy coping skills. And this can become a good cycle happening rather than a bad cycle spiraling down. So what's the result of what happens? So how many have heard of the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study? Okay, excellent. Because many places, people have still not heard of this, including in healthcare. And it's still a mystery, which is why I often call it the most important study you've probably never heard of. So congratulations on being advanced. So this study, just to remind you, was the first time someone looked at a huge cohort of adults and said, what happened to you as children? And then tried to connect it to what happened, what the outcomes were later on. I want to be very clear about something because a lot of folks who are familiar with the study forget something. They say, oh yes, this is a study of what happens to poor people. It is actually not a study of poor people. It was a study of the middle class. Okay, these were folks who were largely Caucasian, college educated, in their 50s at the time of the study, and split between men and women. This is not an impoverished at-risk population, okay, which makes this such a striking study. They looked at these different categories of abuse and neglect, and remember that these were the prevalence of these things in that population. 26% reported that they were physically abused as a child. I mean, this is sky high. No one expected that number to be that high. And again, this study's been repeated over and over. There's state-specific studies as well. We're seeing about the same percentages. I was actually at a conference in California on ACEs and so on. I was one of the speakers, and they actually, during one of the sessions, put the 10 ACEs questions up and had people use the little anonymous clickers to respond, because that way you can't ask people to raise their hand and all. And they went through it. The percentages in the room of professionals working in this area and at this conference was eerily similar to these. Right? So this is real. People just don't talk about it. And again, even the smallest number up there, 6%, that's 1 in 20. Okay, that's like a patient a day on average. Now you can't quantify how bad the abuse was, right? We don't have like systems and mechanisms to be able to do that. But you can say how many of these different categories did you have? So that's where the ACE score comes from, just 1 point for each category. And again, about a quarter had only 1, but 4 categories, 5 categories, 6 categories, 1 in 20 for each of those. Okay, so really, really quite prevalent. So then they said, okay, what was the outcomes? So they looked at some medium-term outcomes like development. Okay, this is your development in the first 3 years of life. If you had 5, 6, or 7 adverse childhood experience categories, you had about 75 to nearly 100% risk of developmental delay. That's pretty high compared to if you just had 1 or 2. And we know this takes identification, it takes a family going for evaluation, therapy. I mean, it's not cheap to work on developmental delay. It's important, we do it, we should do it, but you can see the strong association there. This next slide is the one that blew my mind when I first saw it. This is your risk for adult heart disease compared to your ACEs. 7 or 8 adverse childhood experiences resulted in a tripling of the odds of adult cardiac disease compared to someone who had none. And this holds up for many, many, many different things. I won't walk through all the slides, but even small changes. This is 0 ACEs, 1 category, 2 or more. depression risk goes up, CRP, that marker of inflammation, goes up, other metabolic risk markers clustering goes up, more than one chronic disease go up. But going back to that report, the last point they made was, if we get it right early on, it's more effective and less costly than trying to fix this later on. And really, that's what makes a significant difference. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit for time in case you're following along with slides here. 3 areas we can think about for the early brain and child development. 1, we need to reduce the emotional and behavioral barriers to learning, and I think this is absolutely critical. There are a lot of brilliant, intelligent, smart kids that I have in my practice, and they are flunking out of school, and likely will continue to flunk out of school and will never see what they were capable of, because they have too many of these other issues on top of these fantastic intellects. If nothing else, think about the loss to our society. I have no idea which of the kids in my practice or any other practice out there might have created the next big class of antibiotics, or figured out how to get us to Mars, or worked out world peace, or created the next great symphony, or whatever the case may be. The loss of intellectual power to our society is vast when we don't get it right early on. So we all lose out when we don't figure this out. Number 2, this is not news to you, but it's news to some people and need to be reminded of it. Children live in families. Like, duh, right? But you can't help children if you don't also transform the lives of their parents. Who am I to tell a parent they should be reading to their child every single night if they look at me and say, I'm not home at night because that's when I work the second job so we can make ends meet? You know, oh, you should be spending time playing and interacting face-to-face with your child. It's all I can do to get through dinner and get them to bed because I have diabetes and it's uncontrolled because I can't afford my medication. Okay? Right? I had a parent in my practice just last week. This 4-year-old was just not getting great interaction at home. Dad was the one watching him, and Mom said, Dad wasn't there, but Mom said, yeah, Dad's actually really depressed, and part of it is that he just found out he has diabetes during a hospital stay for some surgery, and we have no insurance, and he's just not able, and he's just been depressed for a while, and it's affecting all of us. The answer was not what I did short term, which was to get our psychologists in the room to kind of help the family with coping strategies, et cetera. The answer was get the guy some insurance and some coverage and get him health care, which we did manage to do. He was on a long, long waiting list for a community health center, and we twisted a few arms and, you know, said, look, it's affecting existing patient of ours, et cetera. And they said, yeah, well, so he's got a visit in a couple of weeks, and hopefully that'll help him out, both in terms of his mental and physical health. But the answer was not band-aid this with a therapist, figure out the root cause of the issue here. And then remembering that all of us have a job in health and well-being, not just those of us who work in medicine and health care, right? That health and well-being is really quite broad. The UW Population Health Institute has this model where we point out that the health factors that go into outcomes, 30% are health behaviors, 40% are social and economic factors, 10% are physical environment. Clinical care is only 20% of the answer. So I direct our MD MPH program at the University of Wisconsin, and one of the things I try to tell people is that we're trying to get you that other 80% to figure out how do you pull these other 80 levers when you're always focusing on the 20 that are here. Because the world of pediatrics, the way I think about what we do in primary care really is this notion of developmental assurance. How do we build a healthy mind, brain, and body for good social purpose? And to really kind of make a difference for children and families, you know, over time. So I want to move ahead and talk a bit about solutions. There's no one magic solution, so all I have to offer you are principles of solutions. So what are the types of things that we need? We need solutions that build capabilities, right? The parent who doesn't know how to do face-to-face play, we can teach them that. That's not real hard. So how do you build that capability? We might need to build capacity. They might know how to do it, but they can't do it because they're working a second or a third job or et cetera. So what can we do to kind of lift some of that burden off of them? We want things that are based in homes and communities, not make them come to a specific place that's not where they are already. We want to address root causes, try to deal with the long-term effects and have those long-term effects, use a prevention mindset, use these key first 1,000 days of life and leverage them as much as possible. We want things that are evidence-guided. You notice I don't say evidence-based. I think evidence-based is important, but we don't have evidence for a lot of the things we do. We don't, and for some of these things we're never going to be able to get reasonable evidence, and for some we just need to work more on research. And while we're working on that research, use evidence, but for crying out loud, use things that also make sense, test them out, try them out, etc. Our funders need to hear this too. The number of times I go places, well, is this evidence-based? It's like, well, if you want evidence-based in pediatrics, here, I will show you the 4 things we do. I'm exaggerating, but you know, there's this focus on only evidence-based. We need to be able to think beyond the evidence because we might actually limit innovation. And we need things we can take to scale. That's really hard. Home visiting's fantastic. I love home visiting. Home visitors do a great job. I do not see enough home visitors in my practice because we can't afford it. Our society can't afford it. Home visiting's $5,000 to $10,000 a year per family. Okay? It's great results, but we can't scale that. So we need to think about things that are scalable as well. Example of a scalable intervention are programs like Reach Out and Read, which, by the way, started in a clinic at Boston City Hospital down the hall from where I was coding those face-to-face videotapes 30 years ago. And really, when we get it right with reading, as my colleague Perry Klass says, reading shows you it's a triumph of the early brain, and it's an intervention that really works so well. And I like to think about this as being like the story of the blind man and the elephant, who are all feeling the elephant and, you know, and kind of noticing different things. Well, Reach Out and Read is kind of like that elephant. So people say, oh, you're giving away books. It's like, well, yes, I think that's the most visible part of the program that people think of. But we're also trying to intervene around education and prevent us having discussions 10 years later about how the kid is flunking. We're using it as a way to do developmental surveillance in a quick and effective way. We're using it to build the parental capacity, to model how to do dialogic reading, that back and forth that is so effective with toddlers. We're using it to assess the relationship. The toddler who takes that book, studies it, turns around and holds it out to their parent in that read to me gesture, they tell you volumes with that. I know what this thing is. We sit down and we look at it together. We've done this before, and if I turn around and hold it out to you, I believe you're actually going to say yes on this, right? That they're telling you that there's a trust and a shared experience that's there. It's a way to buffer toxic stress. You sit down for a few minutes at night, the physical closeness, reading aloud together, all that is part of buffering toxic stress and building strong relationships. It's, of course, a public health approach, and it's a scalable model, and yes, it's actually evidence-based with like 16 studies showing that it does have positive language and home literacy environment effects and so on. So, of course, it's not any one of these things. It's really all of these things when it comes down to it. And if you're interested in reading more about these sorts of principles, a colleague and I actually wrote a monograph that's a free download called The Elephant in the Clinic, published by the Aspen Institute. If you go to Google and just type The Elephant in the Clinic, it pops right up. And the whole thing's on there, and we go into each of these things in depth. And even if you're not implementing Reach Out and Read and so on, just even reading about these ideas and concepts gives you the notion of, this is the type of multi-pronged intervention that we need. Because when you look at other interventions, they are out there. There's programs like resilience training and positive parenting and parent-child home and play and learn. You notice that I put question marks next to clinic and hospital because most of these probably need to be delivered outside of traditional clinical settings. But we still need to know about them and refer parents to them and encourage parents to take advantage of them. We also all can use good poverty-aware approaches to care. Okay, so it's sadly we know this happens way too often. Someone no-shows for a visit and someone says, why don't these people just call? Why are they not showing up? Don't they care about, et cetera, right? The thing is, if we actually looked at the number of tasks that people in poverty are having to take on, just to get food assistance, just to get transportation, just to get child care, just to have any of these things, and it's just enough to barely get there. It's not, fancy stuff. We're asking them to do a lot, and if we were in those same positions, we would actually make the same decisions rationally based on the time and the importance. So when a parent no-shows, I've had this happen to me twice, kiddo with status asthmaticus in the PICU, et cetera, intubated, whole 9 yards, gets better, send him home, and then they no-show for their asthma clinic follow-up. Don't they care about their kid? They nearly died. Yeah, they care just fine. Well, one, guess what? Their kid's not coughing or wheezing or short of breath because we dipped them in steroids for like days, right? So they're still fine, okay? But number two, their kid's doing reasonably okay, and they need to get over to get their SNAP benefits so they can put dinner on the table that night. dinner on the table that night is always going to win over a follow-up visit for a kid who seems to be doing okay right at that moment. Okay, because it's not I can do this and this, it's I have to pick one of these two things, and so on and so forth. So recognizing these things and building this into our appointment structure and where we send people. Our asthma clinic that people often get sent to is in a part of Madison that there's only 2 buses that go there, and most of the families I serve don't actually know that part of town. It's a challenge to get there. And somehow we keep sending them there, and they keep no-showing, and we seem to think magically that one day it's going to happen. No, we need to figure out a better solution. In the community, we can do other things, education about early brain and child development, mentoring activities, and even other things that are about building these social connections. Outside the clinical realm, doing skill building, which we'll talk about in a moment, but making sure that other folks are hearing about this as well as policymakers, judicial, foster care systems, etc. I've actually been to 2 conferences in Colorado that were actually judicial conferences, and I had judges up there talking about toxic stress and some of these things. It was actually fascinating. They were actually understanding that how this matters for the work they do with families and children and foster care and placement decisions and so on. Because when it comes to treatment, we don't have tons to offer that's workable, scalable, and effective for families. There's evidence-based treatments out there, but the ability to actually do them in a reality-based setting is really, really hard. I want to share a video with you that talks about building adult capacity.
The social challenges that face modern societies, whether it's the ability to work productively, to be a good citizen, stay healthy, have their roots in early health and development. A strong foundation in early childhood results in much better and more effective development later. A weak foundation really puts us behind. The most important thing children need to thrive is to live in an environment of relationships that begins in their family, but also extends out to include adults who aren't family members in child care centers and other programs. What children need is for that entire environment of relationships to be invested in their healthy development. We've shown from decades of testing interventions that we can improve outcomes. But the magnitude of those impacts is not good enough. Science is now available to help us think about what we might do that would have a bigger impact than the best of what we've done before. So we began to ask, what could we be doing differently? What could we do to be smarter? Children who are at the greatest risk for the poorest outcomes in learning and health and behavior are children who experience a pileup, a cumulative burden of one after another of risk factors. And then the burden is more than any child could be expected to overcome. So we began to focus on the development of the adults. What could we be doing to strengthen the capacity of everyone who interacts with children? This led us to think about the kinds of skills you need to deal with adversity. These skills of focusing attention, planning, monitoring, delaying gratification, being able to solve problems, being able to work in teams, executive function and self-regulation. They're also the kind of skills you need to create a well-regulated home and school environment in which healthy development and learning can take place. And then brain science started to tell us that differences in those skills start to develop in infancy based on the environment kids live in. So how do those skills get built? Well, if you don't develop them early, how do you develop them later? Actually, you can build them later because the period of flexibility and plasticity for this part of the brain doesn't fully mature until age 25 to 30. And then the light bulb went on. The reason we're not getting a bigger impact is not because we don't know about how to influence development, but because we're giving information and advice to people who we need to do active skill building with. Skill building by coaching, by training, by practice. But we're not doing that. So we now have developed this theory of change that says we need to focus on the development of the adults who are important in kids' lives.
So try this.
How does that work?
That's a new idea.
Buen trabajo.
We need to focus on their skills, their needs, in order for them to be better, more effective parents, in order for them to be better prepared to be employable, which would enhance the economic stability of the family, which is also good for children. Second of all, we looked at many people in preschool programs and childcare centers. And we said, what are we doing to build those skills in the providers? They need skill building as well. And also the community can help to build and reinforce the capacities that parents need. And the community also includes programs in which the people who work in the programs have sufficient skills. Third of all, what are the major sources of toxic stress in this community, and how can we reduce them? Moving it up to a policy level, how are our policies strengthening communities' abilities to reduce source of toxic stress and caregivers' abilities to provide what kids need?
So hopefully that brings a lot of these concepts together about the skill building and how critical that becomes. So to close, kind of to wrap up kind of conceptually this whole idea, thinking about how we build healthy models in kind of a multi-step process here. So we know that kids will fall, and we need a net to catch them. Our first and largest net, which does have big holes, is really these primary prevention approaches that we do for everyone. You know, Reach and Read, Bright Futures, social supports, high-quality childcare, et cetera, et cetera. For the kids who fall through those holes, we bring out a second net. It's a smaller net because it's pricier, but it has smaller holes. And that's where you get the folks that we consider at risk, home visiting, Head Start, early intervention, et cetera, et cetera. You know that a few kids are still going to fall through. That's where you haul out your smallest net. And that's with the smallest holes. You can't afford this fine a mesh at this size, right? Or it's too expensive. It's like doing home visiting for everyone. Although there are countries in Europe that do manage that. But that's for the kids who are the ones that are falling through and actually symptomatic and that need treatment and so on. All of these levels are necessary. None of them on their own are sufficient to be able to really make things work. So that's really, I think, important to think about because we can't just do it all on one level. I started by reading to you from The Dot. And why did I pick that? Because that story is fundamentally about connections. It's about relationships. It's about skill building, right? The teacher was doing skill building in Vashti and helping her really blossom. She didn't tell her how to make these different colors and, you know, the different size dots, et cetera, but she let her know that, hey, I support you, and let her own natural skills come down. The other thing is, what did Vashti do at the end? She turned around and mentored someone else, right? So it becomes a cycle that moves forward once it's shown to you once that it can actually have this ripple effect out there. And we can make these things happen in policy. We have this joint resolution that came out of the Wisconsin legislature just a few years ago. You know, our legislature, like many, has been very contentious over a number of issues. This came through our Senate and our Assembly unanimously. So what is it that they agreed on? I'll read you the resolved clause very quickly. Resolved by the Senate, the Assembly concurring, that policy decisions enacted by the Wisconsin State Legislature will acknowledge and take into account the principles of early childhood brain development and will, whenever possible, consider the concepts of toxic stress, early adversity, and buffering relationships, and note the role of early intervention and investment in early childhood years as important strategies to achieve a lasting foundation for a more prosperous and sustainable state through investing in human capital. I might have written 2/3 of that. But this went through. Now, it's a resolution. It doesn't have money tied to it. It doesn't have force of law. But it got these words in front of the legislature. It actually led to the formation of our first, children's caucus, so on and so forth. And we kept the name of any program out of this. We did not make this an ad for Reach Out and Read or foster care or anything like that. This was meant as a gift to anyone who works with children, whether it's in health, education, anything else. So slowly, we're the first state legislature in the country to do something like this. A few others have followed. Yours might consider it. I hear that might be in the works. But that's why I put the success kit up there solely, that we are solely hashtag winning as we move forward. I want to close with a quote for you and a photo. While schools can do much to raise achievement among children who initially lag behind their peers, all too often preschool gaps set and train a pattern of ever-increasing inequality during school years and beyond. Any drive to improve social mobility must begin with an effective strategy to nurture the fledgling talent in young children, so often lost before it has had a chance to flourish. I see that happen far too often in my clinic, despite our best efforts. We can do better. We need to do things more broadly, and we know what to do. We just need to have the will to implement it as a society. I always end with this photograph. This is my wife reading to my son years ago. I just caught them in this beautiful moment of being lost in a book together. It reminds me that children are made readers in the laps of their parents, and also that parents are their child's first and best teachers. So whatever we can do to support that and enhance them in that role that they want to do is really central to so many of the efforts that we should be doing over time. This is my email address and my public-facing social media links for folks who enjoy following along with those sorts of things. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that folks have. Thank you.
Any questions?
I was just wondering, working with kids who have chronic illness, would, prolonged medical treatment be considered toxic stress?
It certainly could be. I would argue that also sometimes certain chronic illnesses can predispose to conditions that result in at least poorer brain development and so on. So my institution is a significant center nationally for kids with spinal muscular atrophy, SMA. So we see a lot of kids that are coming from a long distance. I remember as a resident, many of them being parked in our ICU rooms, et cetera, with a DVD player like in front of them, because cognitively they start normal, like they have the same potential, but they're often not getting that stimulation, and parents aren't recognizing it sometimes themselves, and there's so much focus on, their lungs and everything else that I don't know how often the parents are hearing about the importance of cognitive stimulation, and how much time also beleaguered parents who are trying their hardest to keep up with all the other things are now able to devote energy to that as well. One of our volunteer readers, who's actually a children's librarian, actually in the waiting room, went up to a family with a child with SMA and said, "Oh, can I read aloud to your child?" And Dad was like, "Yeah, sure, whatever." And she started reading, and her face was lighting up, and she was cooing a little bit, and doing whatever range of expression she was able to do with her condition. And when she finished, she looked back up at Dad, and he was just stunned. He had not seen that sort of display of interactivity and lighting up, and his words were, I guess we should start reading to her. And it took a simple modeling for that to happen.
Some of your initial videos reminded me of rounds that I attended like 45 years ago with Barry Brazelton.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if, in terms of history of medicine, would you say that Dr. Brazelton and others are some of the ancestors of this, and who are the others?
Yes, so T. Barry Brazelton is certainly, and actually it was he was around the child development unit quite a bit when I was there, and a lot of his thinking has influenced this and the work that I've now found myself doing. I think the magic of what people like Dr. Brazelton and others was really recognizing how important it was to support and nurture these connections. I think, traditionally, right, a lot of these things medicine would just kind of put off in that's the psychologist, that's the social worker, that's someone else's job, where, we're here to fix disease. And as we've gotten a lot better at fixing disease and also preventing disease, immunizations, et cetera, we've come to realize that a lot of these new morbidities, the ADHDs, the school failures, the obesities, and so on, a lot of them have their roots in human behavior. And now we're going back and pulling out that work from folks like T. Barry Brazelton. There's others out there, Ben Segal does some work on thinking about, mind sight. How do you develop that perspective in the brain? There's a lot of work that's looking at the interactions between parents and children. And also, we're also starting to think broadly. So, okay, pediatrics, right? We think about kids, et cetera, et cetera. We've also started to recognize that while we may not be the direct caregivers for parents and caregivers themselves, we need to address their needs as well, because that's the psychosocial context of the child. And I'm seeing more and more of that. And we need to move even beyond parents as the way to get to the child and influence the child, and move to a true two-generation approach where we're doing some solutions that work well for both the child and for the parent. and that don't view one as a route or impediment to the other, and so on.
When you talk about serve and return, it sounds like, as you mentioned, sounds like a tennis game, which most of our clients don't know how to play. May I suggest that we use the term play catch? That the parent throws something at the child, hopefully not very hard, and then the child tosses it back.
Yep, I think that's a great thought. A lot of this is how we try to translate these concepts to other professionals, and then a lot of it is how do we actually talk about it to the clientele we work with. So sometimes when I'm talking about early literacy, I'm talking about dialogic reading. Well, I never ever use the phrase dialogic reading with parents because I'm like, God, it's anything, Instead, I just model it and say, see what's happening here, see how we lit up when you touch that, and so on. So I think that showing and then letting them do it in coaching. And again, I do this in well child visits all the time, and it takes me a minute or two. I get it. We don't have hours of time in well child visits. We have, what's their average face-to-face time nationally, like 17 minutes, right? But to do 3 minutes of this really gives me a lot of the information I need and is a really good use of that face-to-face time rather than sitting there and asking a bunch of checklist questions. So.
Join me in thanking Dr. Navsaria.